So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Lewis North. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at WorkBuzz, and I head up the product and engineering departments here. So my responsibility is to make sure we're building the right products to support you and bring you lots of value, and also then making sure that those products are performant and secure and reliable and that kind of thing as well. So owning that journey. Now, in November, we had our annual conference, our Super Bowl, as we like to call it, WorkBuzz Live. And at that conference, we talked about what's happening with AI in our organizations, and particularly within HR. And really, this webinar is a follow-up to that talk, hopefully to go into a bit more detail, help you shape some of your thinking, give you some of the tools to have conversations with others in your business about AI, and hopefully reduce some of the fears that are out there around that as well. Now, I'm very pleased to welcome the brilliant Jarret Hardie onto this with me as well. I'll let Jarret introduce himself, but he's one of the smartest people I know. And I find every conversation with him incredibly stimulating, and he's full of brilliant insight. So I've built him up a lot. But Jarret, I'll hand over to you if you just want to introduce yourself as well.
There's no way I can live up to that, so I may as well just dial off now. Thank you, Lewis. I'm really grateful for the invite today and chance to speak and to meet some new faces. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Sova Assessment. We are a assessment platform either for recruitment screening, for interviews, or for assessment centers. Our goal really is to help people make science-based, data-driven decisions, whether that's in hiring or occasionally for internal development purposes. I've always been sort of a pure tech person, having started at Netscape, but have been in and around the HR space for most of my career, including prior to Sova working at Right Management and Aon, which I think will be familiar to many of the people on the call. So really looking forward to the conversation today, Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's press on. We're going to cover 4 topics today, and then we'll move into a Q&A session at the end. So we'll have a look at the types of AI, typical types of AI, and some sample use cases. And just really, we're trying to do this in a way that's accessible and easy to understand. We'll then have a look at some tangible and safe ways that you can use AI in your organizations, briefly touch on governance and control and some of the guardrails you should put in place, and then how to talk AI with senior leaders in your organization before we then move on to the Q&A at the end. I will stop at the end of each section as well. So if you've got questions that you would like to ask, please do that, and we'll try and answer those at the end of each section. And then we'll have the separate Q&A at the end as well. So let's get started. So we're going to look at 4 different types of AI first. We're going to look at predictive analytics. We will look at machine learning, at natural language processing, and generative AI. And within each of those, we'll look at what it is in simple terms, how it's typically used, and give you a few bits of useful information that go with each of these as well. Now, don't expect to be PhD grade students at the end of this. This is a very high level kind of overview of what each of these are and how you could see them in the real world. So let's get started on predictive analytics. So what is it to begin with? Predictive analytics is the use of historical data and statistical models to find patterns and predict future outcomes. So quite often it's things like regression analysis. So it's used for predicting continuous numerical outcomes. So for example, looking at staff churn versus tenure, or it's used for doing kind of binary classifications and taking these data sets and looking at will an employee leave the business or not, as a kind of binary yes, no, that kind of thing. We also get into very cool things like decision tree models, which is like splitting data across different branches, such as segmenting customers or demographic splits on employees. We then get into things like taking that a step further, a random forest, which has a very cool name, and that is effectively a collection of these decision trees to try and improve the accuracy of their outputs. And we have clustering, which is things like looking for patterns in seemingly unrelated data sets as well. So looking for patterns amongst those. So some typical examples of that are things like forecasting employee turnover rates. So, you may take performance reviews, engagement scores, tenure, absenteeism, manager feedback, that sort of stuff, and kind of combine all of that data together to look for trends to be able to predict which employees are most likely to leave your business or which department is likely to experience the greatest level of churn of employees. And the benefits to you as HR practitioners is actually allowing you to proactively get in front of that and engage with those at-risk employees before they leave the business to help improve retention. And obviously, there's huge cost savings in retaining more people. It could also be things like workforce planning. So seasonal workforces. Let's say, for example, you have a chain of restaurants. You could look at historical customer numbers. You could combine that with customer trends you're seeing in the more recent past, and then look at other, big external events like, I don't know, maybe there's a World Cup or school terms or hiring trends, and piece all of that together to make sense of what your plans should be for seasonal workforce in the coming future. I think, Jarret, you're probably best placed to talk about the predicting performance of employees section. So maybe you want to cover this one.
Yeah, predictive analytics, interestingly, has been, I think, used without people realizing it for decades. It's been basically the basic building block for all psychometric assessment used for pre-hire or for development purposes. Sometimes referred to as AI light, although I think now it's no longer light. I think a lot of the use cases you just described, Lewis, have really only become possible with some of the advances in computing and power that we've got these days. But interestingly, predictive analytics, even though I just referred to it as AI light, is actually considered AI in terms of some of the hiring legislation that has come out in the last couple of years. So with the rise of AI in recruitment in particular, both the New York and California laws in the US, the new EU Act, and even the UK guidance from the Information Commissioner's Office all consider predictive analytics to be part of an AI framework that needs to be thought of for data privacy. So now we're kind of just expanding its use, I think, really.
Yeah. And there's a couple of bits of additional information. So with predictive analytics and anything like this, these sort of early versions of AI, they require tons and tons of training data to build out a model that you can then use for future analysis. The other sort of key piece with predictive analytics is it's a fairly static model. So once you've built that model out, it can analyze that data, but if you need to make adjustments to that, you need to then retrain that model to adjust it for future analysis. And just to monitor as well, things like model creep, making sure that it continues to be accurate as well. Let's go on to the next one. So machine learning. You will have no doubt heard of machine learning as well, I'm sure. It's probably the use of AI that's been the most popular up until the rise of things like ChatGPT and generative AI. So it's a system that learns patterns from data and uses them to make predictions or decisions. The big difference from this to predictive analytics is actually that it's continuing to learn over time as well. So as it sees new data, it's processing that and adapting the model automatically without actually having to need any additional programming to do that. So a classic example of that is things like recommendation engines. So things like Spotify and Netflix. So as it learns more about your watching habits, it can predict other things that you would be interested in watching. The other really common use for machine learning is sentiment analysis of open comments. So in our own platform, we've had it for quite a long time, and it is a machine learning model that we have that's trained on our own data that looks at open comments and is able to then apply a sentiment score to those comments based on whether it's neutral, negative, or positive, using those models that we've trained on tens of thousands of other comments. So it's a useful way for us to help you make sense of that and group those into positive, neutral, or negative comments. And as I said, recommendation engines is another classic use, and we have that in our platform for our recommended actions for survey results. So looking at the results of your survey, it can then recommend which questions you need to focus on and how you should drive change in your business and what those actions you should do are to help drive change. So it's recommending them to you based on your survey results. Jarret, I'm sure you've got lots to contribute on this. So
the classic example, I think, of machine learning in sort of assessment and interview screening is the recorded video interview. It's been around, I think, for probably 7 or 8 years now. A candidate applying for a role might record themselves answering a question on a video interview. There's nobody on the other end. That video interview is then usually scored in their own time by a hiring manager or a talent acquisition specialist. Many years ago, that obviously for volume roles started to become quite onerous. So machine learning to the rescue, helping to kind of score a lot of the videos, or at least recommend the top candidates for a human to then go and look at. The irony, of course, now being that that was cutting edge technology 8 years ago, but is now being threatened by ChatGPT, with candidates able to use those tools to basically craft the perfect video interview answer.
Yeah, so it's a bit of an arms race at the moment, isn't it? Of trying to outsmart each other on.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. AI coming to fight AI, but also coming to rescue its use case as well.
Yes. So a couple of useful bits of information here. So as I said earlier, these models do evolve. So as it receives new data, it can adapt to that and continue to learn. It's also good at handling non-linear relationships and unstructured data. So by non-linear, I mean not a straight line. So a classic example is like engagement scores and tenure, which is a bit like an inverse bell curve where there's a dip at 3 to 5 years as people start to their relationship with the organization changes at that point is probably the way to describe that. So it's good in those scenarios. Natural language processing. The geek in me couldn't help but use C3PO. Star Wars. He was a language droid, wasn't he? Or a translation droid. So natural language processing is a subset of AI that enables computers to understand, interpret, and respond to human language in text or speech form. How this is often used is things like named entity extraction, so looking for personally identifiable information in data sets. It's looking for things like extracting meaning from unstructured text, so topic extraction, keyword matching, that kind of thing. And obviously translation services as well, so things like Google Translate are the classic kind of uses of natural language processing. I think the key piece here actually is these systems are about interpreting and understanding the language, but not necessarily generating new content in those languages. Is there any other bits, Jarret, you think we should cover on this section?
I think you've summarized it really well. Obviously, natural language processing is the underpinning block for the generative AI piece, which I think is coming up next.
It is, yeah. So yes, generative AI. This is probably the one that lots of you have heard about. And really, this is the piece that sparked this explosion again in the interest in AI. And for those of you that are familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, which is this like roller coaster of how new technologies are adopted into society, and there's this like trigger point that causes this explosion of interest. And really, if you look at the release of ChatGPT, probably 2, 3, which was I think 2021, 22, something like that.
30th of November 2022, almost
Very good.
just past the second year anniversary.
Yes. So that really was the explosion, wasn't it, of this interest again in generative AI. The big difference here is this is a pre-trained model. So effectively, these large language models have been pre-trained on huge swathes of content from across the internet and various other sources. So they're pre-trained, so you don't need to train them. And really, they are just amazing prediction engines. So based on all of that content, they're very, very good at predicting what the next word will be in that sentence and taking language and text from you as an input and generating text, code, images, all sorts of things. And we're now progressing into these multimodal models that are able to do, images, text, code, all of it from one model as well. So how can it be used? Hopefully, you've all had a chance to dabble with ChatGPT, with Claude, which is Anthropic's version of ChatGPT, with Gemini, with Copilot, with Meta. All of the big tech players have these generative AI systems and large language models. They are amazing at doing things like composing emails from bullet points, from creating job descriptions and adverts, and rewriting learning and development resources, making them specific for the user or for the department or for the type of work you're doing. So it's not a one size fits all anymore. You can adapt this content specifically for the audience and, crafting interview questions, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to look at, the uses for generative AI just across HR. Because of course, all the investment has been going into the tools, the underlying infrastructure with the big companies, Facebook and Google and Microsoft. It was mind-boggling, some of the investment that's gone into it. I think I remember seeing that ChatGPT 3, the one that everybody got on their radar 2 years ago, was trained on 485 billion words. And at a cost of $40 million to do that original training. So all of this effort has gone into generative AI, and I think we're only now starting to look at what we can do with it. So the tools have been built; they're out in the hands of you and me and everybody on this call. Certainly in the assessment space, we're only now beginning to explore with interview guides, for example, for hiring managers using generative AI. And the results are really encouraging for, I think, what the future holds. It's a very, very fast moving field. It feels almost like, I don't know about you, Lewis, but it almost feels like every month one of these companies releases a version of their tool that leapfrogs everybody else.
Absolutely. And I think the Gemini 2 has recently come out, hasn't it? As well as GPT-4. No, 01 now is the latest one, isn't it?
Yeah.
And they are getting more and more advanced, more and more capable. The multimodal capabilities of it are astonishing. I think I read recently that OpenAI just closed a funding round of 6.6 billion, based on a valuation of 157 billion. And it's an incredible amount of money that's being tipped into these products, isn't it? And for them, it is an arms race as well. We've seen this with lots of our platform is within AWS. So AWS are very keen for us to use their services to support this, to the point where they're co-funding development work with us to encourage us to do that as well. So it's incredibly fast paced.
Well, thankfully, I mean, Google have invested $4 billion in Claude, which is running on AWS. So they're keeping up with the Joneses, as it were. Um, I think it's also quite interesting to think about what might happen now that all of the Gen AI providers are investing in agents. So tools that can actually do things for you on your computer or possibly in your workplace, that might actually lead to some very significant efficiency gains, but also carry with it obviously some risks, in terms of privacy and also just accountability for some of the actions that it's taking.
It's this whole topic of agentic AI is definitely something that we're hearing more and more of. And if you listen to podcasts, Josh Bersin, for example,
Mm.
I know that he's pushing his own product here, but he talks a lot about having chat interfaces with natural language and using generative AI under the hood that can connect up systems. So you could have a all-encompassing HR chatbot that can actually connect to your scheduling system, to book holidays, to all sorts of other services, and be able to take some of that kind of toil work out of the HR department. I feel like that's is absolutely coming, and I think there's wide-ranging impacts for all of us as software providers being open and being able to accept these requests from other systems and that kind of thing as well. Um, how do you feel about whether that will be dominated by one of the big players? Do you think that one of the big players, like, I don't know, Workday or Sage or Salesforce, Microsoft, do you think that will become the source of truth for these agents?
I think that is a definite possibility. What we saw with Apple Intelligence, which is obviously the consumer end of this, will filter, in my view, into the HRIS landscape. So Apple's big pitch when they launched Apple Intelligence is that unlike ChatGPT or Claude, they have access to all of your data. So you can ask it a question like, what time does my mom's plane land? And it will look in your email, it will look in your messages history, and be able to figure out not only the answer, but who you're talking about. What I'm seeing increasingly from people I talk to at Workday, for example, is that they are taking the same approach. So if they are the single source of truth for your recruitment data, for the assessment data that might have happened during the hiring process, for the employee engagement feedback, and for salary information, they're going to obviously be able to leverage all of those bits of information to come up with, I think, a much more coherent, much more comprehensive answer to the questions that organizations are going to be asking the HR department. Where I think the opportunity for companies like WorkBuzz and Sova to contribute to that is to ensure that our systems play well with those type of generative AI infrastructures, and also benefit, I think, in many cases from data flowing the other way.
Yes, I think if we think about the capabilities of tooling like this, more and more, I think the future will become more like a chat interface. So rather than, and we're trying to do this with some of what we're doing with our People Science AI product, is rather than giving you loads more dashboards, it's actually tell me the answers and then give me a narrow focus on where I should go looking, rather than I don't need 50 more graphs. I just need to be told what the problems are and where to focus my attention. And I feel like increasingly we've seen more of that. We'll see more personalization as well. So
Yeah,
being able to tailor your responses and answers for that individual.
I agree. These tools will, I think, probably lead to a lot more efficiency for people just looking for answers. I think it will help us build intelligent analysis of raw data that you can then kind of have a conversational interaction with, or ask it to produce your board slides for you. Some very entertaining possibilities as well as some very useful ones.
Yes, yes. There's a useful bit of information here is that they talk about these being having billions of parameters quite often. And I think the best way to describe this is if you imagine them to be a bit like the image you can see here with the mixing desk. and all the little twisty knobs for adjusting volumes and that kind of thing. Each of those is a bit like a parameter, and the generative AI is a deep neural net with all of these different parameters. With if you imagine there's billions of these little adjustments that are made to train this model, it kind of gives you the sense of scale of just how big and how powerful these things are. So yeah, billions of twisty dials that are all being adjusted to tune these models. It's quite remarkable, really, and you can see how the costs quickly rack up on training these sorts of models.
Yeah, it's an interesting time because the costs keep dropping too. So I think the ability for people to do more and more with it is going to increase because it's no longer going to be quite as prohibitively expensive. The cost of running Gen AI now is probably 30% of what it was 2 years ago. It's a good time for, I think, all of us to be thinking about how we adapt Gen AI in our organizations and what we expect from the software platforms that we have in our organizations and how they're going to be using Gen AI. It's something that, my team certainly keeps us up at night, wondering how we get the most out of this, basically.
Yes, and I think this is where I think it is important that we get ahead of this. There's obviously the pace of change and the introduction of these tools has outstripped the pace of getting the right frameworks in place in a lot of organizations. And I know we're going to come on to some of that later on, but it's certainly, I don't think I've ever seen anything like this with an adoption of a technology in such a widespread rate so quickly.
The speed of adoption is incredible, and I think it's largely down to just how much this has captured everyone's imagination. Because it's not just something that's applicable in business; it's something that you can use at home, talking to Google Assistant or Siri that are now getting ChatGPT or Claude capabilities. Fairly, I'm still not convinced that companies like OpenAI and Google are going to see a return on their investment in the next decade. The cost that they've had to pump into this and the cost of running it, I think the model, the economic payoff for them is still going to be a problem for the next 10 years.
Yes, I agree. And I think that this is where when you're building software that uses these tools, you have to choose quite wisely because we only have to look at the volatility of OpenAI over the last year or so to sow a seed of doubt around what goes on there and how viable it is at times. Or even with a $6.6 billion raise, it's quite a turbulent time, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a very interesting time as well for data center providers like AWS and Microsoft, who I think are struggling to come up with enough capacity to service demand. And interestingly, in the case of Ireland, enough electricity supply. I think the AWS representative that I've been talking to most frequently was bemoaning the fact that they are restricted in opening new data centers in Ireland, as are Microsoft, as is Oracle, because there's not enough energy supply on the grid, and it's all because of generative AI.
Yes, I can echo that. I've had a similar conversation with them trying to get access to one of the new models through Claude, and power was the answer that I was given. They have sorted that now, but it was not the answer I was expecting. And that
No, me neither.
It's probably why they're investing in nuclear plants and things like that as well. Which is, the generative AI space as well, I think, is particularly interesting where it is multimodal now, and we can do images and video and all sorts of things that go with that as well. And from a creativity aspect, it helps you to fast track ideas and brainstorming and that kind of thing. And I went to a recent in Milton Keynes, they have these things called the Geek Nights, which is a sort of mini conferences. And there was a guy there from a graphics or like a CGI company that does a lot of special effects in the film industry. And he was saying how they use generative AI now to just get ideas out as fast as possible
Oh,
So they still
interesting.
manually do the work at the end, but as a way of just getting a representation up, they use a lot of generative AI to do that. So yeah, really, really fascinating.
I think that's one of its benefits, isn't it? I don't know about your team, but I think my engineering team, for example, definitely use it for a lot of prototyping. Um, Saves an awful lot of time and headache. I think across the business, we're certainly encouraging people to use it in non-engineering roles to help them take some of the early ideas,
Mm.
shape them, work with them a little bit, and then yes, obviously they then the human does the final bit. Don't know if you're seeing a similar thing at WorkBuzz.
Yeah, absolutely. For like early stage prototyping, I know I use it all the time now to try and just get basic examples of things working, and for writing little bits of Python code and that kind of stuff. And it's very fast. It makes me incredibly lazy as well because then if I get an error, I just put an error back in and say, "Can you fix this for me?"
Yeah,
But yeah, like speed to delivery though is dramatically increased, isn't it? And
it
it's brilliant for that.
yeah, it certainly is. And I think our I found, for example, my product team, we recently conducted a market survey, and the initial analysis that Claude performed was so good, including the charts and graphs, that we're looking at how we can now bring a very similar thing to the hiring data. So helping our customers see ROI by using generative AI to analyze the trends across a, say, high volume recruitment process where you've got 10 or 20,000 candidates, and just kind of producing the necessary examples of how either speed to hiring improved or the quality of hire improved. I think a lot of organizations are going to see that in every department. Even departments where you might not assume that this would traditionally apply, like finance, for example.
Mm. Let's see if there's any questions from the floor. If anyone's got any questions, if you want to add them into the webinar chat, we can pick those up now, or we can move on to the next section, which is the tangible and safe ways to use AI. I haven't seen any questions come in yet, but we'll just give it a second, see if anyone wants to add any. I mean, we could talk all day on generative AI, I think, because the capabilities and the possibilities of what you can do with this now are amazing. I know one of my favorite things to do is use it to explain things to me like I'm a 10-year-old. I'm a simple man with a simple brain, and sometimes I just need things explained to me in a very easy way. And I know that we've been using this as part of our upcoming People Science AI product, and there's a thing called a Flesch Kincaid score of 0 to 100, and 0 being the most sophisticated, complex language, and 100 being very easy to consume. And we've been playing with the adjustability of that to change the outputs of those summaries. So it's super fascinating to see how that just adjusts the language that's used. So yeah, right. We don't have any questions at the moment, so let's just move on then to the next topic, which was about tangible and safe ways to use AI. What we'll do, I'll just load these through. So yeah, let's say learning and development. So as we talked about before, using generative AI, it's a great way to kind of build out a framework for a set of training courses. You could adapt that as well to the different departments within your business. So, for example, like I said earlier, it's not a one size fits all arrangement nowadays for training content. You can tailor it specifically for the audience and make it appropriate to that audience. You could then augment that by using tools like Midjourney, which is for image generation, to generate lots of those visualizations for you and the photography. All of the imagery you've seen today, I created using Midjourney. So it gives you a measure of the type of quality that it can produce. It's hard to tell that the woman you can see on the screen is not a real person. That has been generated by a generative AI. I haven't checked actually. Has she got the correct number of fingers? Because that's always the giveaway, isn't it? It looks like there's a rogue finger there. So yeah, the fingers is quite
She's
often.
got the correct number of arms at least. I've seen a few generated images where people are looking like octopi. So She's doing better.
Um, another good use of this is for supporting your people leaders, and we've talked a bit about people science AI before. And what we're trying to do with that is we're trying to solve this double-sided problem that we've seen in our customers and talking to prospects is HR leaders, HR professionals are under a lot of pressure to deliver not only throughout the organization, but upwards as well, and presenting up to exec teams and that kind of thing. So they're under a lot of pressure there. They're quite often time poor. Hopefully this resonates with some of you on the call, that you're time poor, under-resourced, and there's a lot of demands from the business for your time. And then on the other side of this problem, we see that line managers, people leaders, they're often promoted into that role without the experience or the support needed to do that. And they quite often are given access to our report dashboards as well, and not really given the training on how to interpret the data, which questions are more important than others, where they should focus their attention. And what we're trying to do with our People Science AI product is to bring that all together. And really, it's about trying to provide that coaching role for all of your people leaders, so that they understand the why behind listening to your people and what they can expect to achieve by taking their teams on the journey and coaching them through that. So really, it's about trying to do that in a way that helps them get to the right answers quickly and kind of fast tracking that time to insight and where they should start to take action. I think there's another example here, and maybe Jarret, maybe you could talk a bit through about some of this as well.
My favorite topic. We definitely see that AI is, both a tool for good and a tool for evil if misused in recruitment, and that's always been kind of the tension in hiring decisions anyway. On the one hand, you've got people who are concerned about AI making impersonal decisions, about AI introducing bias. We've seen some famous examples. Poster child is actually AWS, Amazon, who trained AI on what good looks like using CVs, and no surprise, AI tended to prefer a certain demographic category above all, because that's who had been hired before, and that's whose CVs they happened to have as training set. But on the flip side, I think we see AI kind of helping in the recruitment side of things. There are some candidates we've found in our surveys who actually feel that assessment and AI will be more fair to them. I mean, obviously they're putting their faith in it, having been trained properly. We're also seeing the rise of the AI-enabled candidate, which is a phenomenon nobody predicted when ChatGPT came out. So CVs are almost now universally well-targeted and beautifully written because they're written by AI. The covering letter is pitch perfect because it's written by AI. And a candidate who could, once, if they were really dedicated, submit 100 applications in a week, can now submit 1,000. So I think many of our customers are finding that actually they're being overwhelmed with applications, and are needing to use AI, strangely enough, in order to wade through the volume of applications that they're getting because of AI. Overall, though, I think the opportunities for fairness when we're talking about AI, both for hiring and also for internal development and movement, are better than kind of the alternative of just not using it at all. I think obviously we've got to be careful that these things are well trained.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So on balance, you would say the good outweighs the bad of what we're seeing from people adopting Gen AI or the use of AI in recruitment, but also on the other side of the
Yeah,
fence.
we again, coming back to the survey that we did, it was sort of a market survey of HR. Obviously, our slant was on recruitment, but we were asking a lot of our customers and our future customers whether they were adopting AI in their organizations. And I think and their attitude towards adopting AI in their organizations. And I would say the majority were either neutral or positive, which compares quite interestingly to 2 years ago when the majority was very much opposed to the use of AI. Attitudes have shifted. They've shifted, I think, both for the HR departments who are overwhelmed and time poor and often understaffed, and they've shifted for candidates as well who, 2 years ago were happy to be judged by a person, not really happy to be judged by an AI, and now are coming to realize that actually, at least for the early stages of the screening process, maybe being judged by the AI will give them a fairer shake. It's interesting to kind of watch the balance shift.
And you can see how that, we talk a lot about bias in AI, don't we? And actually, that is almost as long as the AI is trained well, actually it can help mitigate on bias.
It certainly can. I think we've had a lot of interest in some of the explorations we've been doing for using AI to ensure hiring manager integrity, if you like. So AI that could listen into an interview, for example, and point out cases where actually the human interviewer had probably not given the candidate the best experience, or had maybe not asked questions in an unbiased way. So I think for diversity and inclusiveness, I think there's a lot of opportunity across the organization with some of these tools.
Amazing, thank you. Just looking at the time, we'll carry on and we'll go into the governance and AI and data piece. And really, this is about making sure you're setting yourselves up for success if you are going to look at using AI in your organization. I think my interactions with lots of HR professionals actually is they are quite, they can be early adopters of technology, and actually they are quite tech savvy. And I think it's important that we go into this sort of eyes wide open in many respects of what the implications are of using AI in your organizations. Within AI, we talk a lot, don't we, about data quality. And I know from lots of the courses I've done over the years, there's the phrase is garbage in and garbage out, isn't it? And it's often used to describe that situation. And I think the really, when you're, particularly if you're training models or if you're trying to make sense of data, you may find you need to transform that data slightly and get it into different formats and reorganize it. And quite often that can mean combining data sets together as well. So there's a whole section around data and cleansing your data and making it ready for use of AI.
There certainly is, and I think the regulatory framework around this, or just even the best practices, even if it's not put into law, have lagged behind the technology, and the technology is changing so quickly now. But we now, I think, have a fairly good set of legislation around the world, and come with it a lot of guidance. So, for example, in the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office has toolkits to help you align your use of AI with GDPR. They recommend how to clearly explain how decisions are made with AI. That's the big thing. It's all about transparency and control, so that people who are either interacting with AI or whose HR departments might be making decisions based on AI know when it's being used, how it's being used, what happens with the data after it's been kind of crunched. And I think that's been kind of the big shift, and is where I think actually there's opportunity for everybody on this call to be the guardians of good practice within their organization. I've not spoken to anybody, I don't know if you have, Lewis, who isn't interested in making sure AI is used responsibly.
I think it's the first question we've been asked when we've talked to customers about using our product is about, well, it's interesting actually, lots of the questions are very related to things more like machine learning, of how are you going to use our data? Will it be used to train models? And I think there's definitely an element of catch up needed on some of the thinking around this, particularly around the generative side, where we don't necessarily need their data to train models. we probably would use it to just validate the output matches what a human output would look like. So we're not actually using the data to train the model, it's more to just validate the model, if that makes sense. So it's a slightly different approach to it, isn't there?
It certainly is, and you and I need to provide reassurance to people who use our software that their data sits just with themselves. So it's not going to bleed across other customers using the platform. It's not going to be used to train the underlying model. It is going to be kept securely within kind of their walled data area. And I think that's actually a concern for organizations generally adopting AI. Everybody wants to make sure that they're not going to find their customers' data suddenly being given in response to a chat GPT question by somebody halfway around the world. There's a lot of responsibility, I think, that comes with setting all of this up correctly.
I completely agree. And I think one of the things we've seen as well is this shadow AI happening where people are, because of the pace of change, they're not reacting quick enough to the get frameworks in place. So they're blanket banning the use of ChatGPT, for example. But then people are just emailing documents home to them to their personal email, using it at home, and then emailing it back in, and sort of bypassing those controls that have been put in place. So it really emphasizes the need to try and get ahead of some of that.
It's interesting, actually, because Jamie has just actually asked a question in the chat, which I think relates directly to that, which is how would you recommend approaching the IT and HR partnership for Gen AI to deliver ROI?
I think for me, the cat's out of the bag with the Gen AI, and it's actually about giving them the tools to use it safely. And let's say you use Microsoft Copilot or Microsoft Suite, maybe it's about giving people access to Copilot, but making sure that the instance that it's using is inside the EU as well, and that the data is not being used to train models thereafter. You can't actually do it through ChatGPT at the moment, I don't think. I don't think you can set the instance to be in the EU. It's in the US. So if you do put customer data in or internal team data, that is going outside of the EU. And anything through ChatGPT, the web interface or the app, can be used as training data as well. It is slightly different if you use the API, isn't it? But I think through the web interface and the chat, it is that way.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I agree with what you said a little earlier. One of the things to spell out to IT and HR is that if you don't have something available, people are going to do it anyway, but they're going to do it in the free ChatGPT tool, and that could lead to all sorts of exposure for your data or for your customers' data. I think the other person to involve in the conversation is, believe it or not, finance, because some of these tools are incredibly expensive. To license Microsoft Copilot for everybody in your organization is something like £300 a head for the year, and you have to license it for the whole year. You can't just sort of pay on a monthly basis. What I've seen work internally is we pilot some of these things with select audiences at lower cost and just measure whether they are getting an ROI. So people are invited to participate in the pilot, but the flip side is that they must record some data so that they can measure how it's going for them. I think there's also some free tools available for organizations. So if you go to, I think it was copilot.microsoft.com, if you're an Office 365 organization, and you log in with your company email address and password, the free Copilot is effectively the same as the free ChatGPT, but your data does not leave your Office 365 tenant. So that's sort of a low-cost, safe way to experiment, gather some ROI data that you can then feed back to IT and HR.
Excellent advice. And that will lead us on to the next section in a second. Before we go on to that, I just wanted to show you a real-world example of bias. So I used Midjourney to say, can you create me a realistic photo of a successful business person? I'm sure you can all guess what this looks like, but it's this guy. And, that's a real classic example of what what bias looks like. So it's obviously learnt what a successful business person looks like by scraping lots of images off the internet, and this is the stereotype of what that looks like. So you have to be mindful of this in the outputs that these tools are giving you. So the final bit then is to talk about how to have this conversation with senior leaders, and I think this is really, it's about giving you a framework to help build a business case. So I think the first part is about identifying the business need and what are you going to use this for? How will it benefit the business? And to Jarret's point earlier, talking about return on investment and demonstrating what that can be. I think a big piece here is making sure that it is aligned to the strategic objectives of the organization as well. And starting small with a test, like in the example that Jarret gave, using a small test case initially to prove out this point before you then take it to the wider business, but making sure you do address these privacy and data protection concerns along the way as well. Jarret, is there anything you want to add on that? And just so we've got a bit of time for some questions.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think probably the most important bit really is the data and privacy. And I think every organization's DPO, data protection officer, has been upskilled in the last couple of years on how to do this. I think we're also going to send around a link to the ICO toolkit, which has some good self-service advice in there for people like us and people on this call who are looking to implement this.
Lovely, thank you. So what we'll do, we'll just see if there's any other questions people would like to ask. Now is a great time to do that. We are happy to answer those. So we'll give that a few minutes to see if any come in. Hey, we haven't missed any, have we, whilst we're talking?
Not that I can see, no. We did have a couple that were sent prior, if you want to chip into those, but apart from that, there's nothing else coming in live at the moment.
Yeah, so there's a question of how can we engage people leaders across the business with AI, so managers rather than senior leaders. I made a couple of notes here about, maybe it's about getting a working group together of senior leaders in the organization, defining some of these use cases and experimenting with some of these tools. But absolutely, yes, talk to your IT team about how do we do that safely and what's the environment we can do that in. And really, it's about building out a framework for use that let them go and experiment and come back and share their experiences with us. That's one of the beautiful things about the generative tools is you can ask it a question and then ask follow-up questions or ask it to give you an answer in a different way and kind of add additional context to it. So it's incredibly valuable in that respect. Is there any other bits?
I think many senior leaders are probably receptive to this discussion now. They're probably using it themselves. I know certainly when people came to me to ask if they could use these tools, it was always framed around efficiency and kind of outcomes. That's probably the best way to approach it, is the ROI discussion.
Yeah, and finance.
Yes.
Get the sign off for the budget. There's another question of how can we focus on skills gaps and address these in a world of AI? Have you got any thoughts there, Jarret, or am I putting you on the spot with that one?
No, it's an interesting question. I think, so first of all, the skill for using AI is actually something that is coming up more and more. We have been asked whether we have any assessments for testing people's ability to write good prompts for generative AI. That's an interesting angle of this that I don't think anybody's really cracked yet. There's lots of advice. I'm not sure how scientific the basis is for the advice that's out there at the moment, but it will certainly come. What are you seeing on that front, Lewis?
No, I agree. I think the skills gap for use of AI, I think the barrier to entry to using it is very low, isn't it? But actually getting the most out of it. There's lots of cheat sheets around as well of like how to use prompts to give you the types of answers you want, particularly on things like Mid-Journey, if you want a particular style of image to come back, that kind of thing. The prompts used in text output as well, being able to change the style of that as well, so make it more or less formal. You may have seen some of the ads recently around the Apple AI product about guys ranting about someone's taken his food from the fridge, isn't it? And
Yeah.
he vents with full steam and vigor about that, and then softens it with a click of a button. And that sort of stuff's really capable within generative AI. So I think there's definitely a need to do that. I think across the business and addressing other skills gaps, that may be where actually we're looking at then some of the more traditional AI models to look at performance and look at capability and try and look for a gap analysis of what good looks like and how do you mirror that back against the rest of the workforce. There's
a lot of opportunity for that. I think, particularly, organizations like WorkBuzz have a lot to bring to the table there with generative AI, identifying talent and skills that you might not otherwise have found without this new technology. I think that's the promise that a lot of people are hoping is going to be realized in the next couple of years.